What we'll be sharing this morning would be how we've used crime and asset mapping together to guide community interventions. There are different scales of how the mapping would work, and it's something that we've tried to apply and something that is very important in terms of our national development in Jamaica. Heather and other presenters yesterday spoke about different studies that have been conducted in Jamaica. And one of the very important things we have to understand is the importance of and the difference between national scales and subnational scales. But we'll be using GIS and mapping to do actual engagements. Everything you'll be seeing this morning is going to be actual data, practical data that's being used right now and has been used for anything ranging from engagement of civic leaders, business leaders, academics, policymakers, and law enforcement. And we integrate many different types of data sets into this equation, not just social data, but also infrastructural data, roads, but also environmental data as well. And this can guide and monitor different funded programs by the multilateral organizations or internal private sector foundations and so on. Hotspots is something that I think Laura is going to be speaking about later. Hotspots reveal different patterns and show how our resources can be deployed differently. But again, there are scales to how you apply hotspots and the data that you apply it to. In the case of our social variables, our education pattern in Jamaica is not uniform. Some areas are better educated than others. Some areas have better access to education than others. Areas in Kingston have different levels and rates of unemployment. And this is something that can be revealed to explain the pattern that we're going to see later on. The patterns of churches and schools are important. The relationships between these very important and critical social infrastructure and crime and violence show very stark patterns in terms of how intervention can be guided through different civic institutions and what can be done. It also helps us to identify where we would be using and deploying owners of the solutions that we propose. It's not going to be a helicopter approach, a national policy level. It's going to require engagement at a very, very local scale, and we need to zoom in on that. We look at even the fiber optic network in Jamaica, access to the internet, access to high-speed internet. Where are these in relation to crime? Where are these in relation to those schools and churches where you're going to set up after-school programs and whatever? How do you engage the private sector leaders to fund telecommunication activities that can promote education through the internet and the usage of high-tech services? We look at business exclusions. Where are the businesses, the employers located versus where the people live? The red areas show where people live. The dots that are circling the map are where the businesses are. You can see that in the areas in red, there are very few businesses, very few employment opportunities. But this will also guide, Shane, the location of transport services. Do buses get into these areas where people are? Are people walking on these streets at night to get home? Those areas also correspond to very high crime levels as well. So we get to see the interplay between many different features in the system. Now, when you look at operational crime maps, we can see not just the location of gangs, but we can see their political associations and the movements of those gangs. We also can look at different subsections, I call them informal communities, where the people define which is their turf. And this is something that we can define, again, not from a policy level, but it's something where the people define what is their community, and we can use this to guide their own engagements. Now we're going into community scale. We're looking at asset mapping, how these collect not just information on the presence or absence of a particular asset, but a building condition, a building type, and specific categories. So you want to know where the vacant lots are versus the bar that is in a rundown condition, separate from the bar that's in a good condition. So all of these things are considered when we do this. And I think we've done over 24 communities, every single thing, every single light pole, fire hydrant.
52 communities.
52. So we have so many different communities that we've asset mapped at different scales and all to extremely granular detail. This includes individual houses as well, not just the non-residential entities. So these are more examples of the different asset maps. But on the right, you'll see where we've actually done some weighted modeling. We show which assets are in worse condition. And there is a direct correlation between asset condition and crimes and crime types. But beyond that, you can also use the asset maps to help guide your community intervention. You can look at the building condition to target which ones you're going to focus on, but you also want to look at the logistics of how you're going to get in there, access, whether there are other kinds of physical infrastructure in those areas, like gullies or whatever, that may impede or enhance your intervention and your engagements. But then we want to connect crime, we want to connect the assets, and we want to connect law enforcement. How do we identify where crimes, what types of crimes are occurring? How do you get in there? What do we expect when we get in there? So we're able to look at these things. But to track police responsiveness, we look at how far the police have to travel to get to a particular crime. So on the bottom right, you can see a graph that shows the response times in 2014 versus 2015 by type of crime, by vehicle or transportation method used, by weapon used, and by whether or not these things are gang-related or not gang-related. Domestic violence has a very random pattern, while gang violence have very specific patterns. We can connect this to ballistics forensics. We can trace which gun is used in which crime, how far those crimes are apart, and we're able to inform the police into their own interventions. But when you connect the community asset data to this ballistics information, you know what to expect and what's going on in these areas. Intelligence and response is no longer instinctive and subjective. It is now information-based. And then we're able to look at not just where and how far the police go, but in terms of their own service delivery and their ranges of response. Areas where you have overlaps of different police stations crisscrossing into each other's areas talks about whether or not you have operational efficiencies going on within the law enforcement framework. So we've been using the maps to identify and prioritize communities, to provide the assets and the background information before you head in there. But also, one of the most gratifying things for me in doing all of this is how the maps facilitate communication between different groups of people. Where you have trust issues between the police and the community, when they're speaking to a common map, it flattens that disconnect. And it's something that has been very impressive. Then we also use it to engage fundraising, planning, and program management. And these are how a lot of what we've done and continue to do using mapping. So we try to get ahead of the problem. And we look at how cost of care, Professor Shepard, how these things begin to plug into the equation and what we do with this information. So we have done mapping of several major hospitals in Jamaica, looking at where the cases are and which hospital and where the cases coming to each hospitals are coming from. And this allows us to really get a sense of getting ahead of the problem. Prevention is better than treatment. And we can see for both violence-related injuries and road traffic accidents, we can see what's going on and the range people travel to get to hospital. Sometimes people die on the way to the hospital because it's so far. With that, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Ward. She will wrap up this presentation. Yeah, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Really, what we say is when you have this data, what you have to be able to do is to understand that using this data-driven, coordinated, and sustained approach, which is very important, you have to have good community policing and good relationships with the police and the community. and you have to have a supportive political environment for it to last. And what we've seen is once we have the data and we're in the community, that you move through 4 steps, moving a community from one that has been torn apart by violence and crisis into community building activities and into community development and then community safety and stability. 1 or 2 things to point out is many agencies have to get involved. The Peace Management Initiative, the church, the police, and a lot of the maps that we showed, bring those people on board, train counselors. We find there's a big problem with complex grief. A lot of healing and reconciliation has to go on, and a lot of issues of literacy are important, and the availability of green spaces. Also, you have to have development. You notice where there's no businesses in these communities. We have to get investment in these communities. And what we find facilitates that is that you get community engagement and peace councils, and you build the connections with the business community to get that investment, or even the multilateral agencies. So where you start to move towards sufficiency is when you have those integrated economic activities occurring. Again, multiple agencies to perform. So the steps involved: engage a whole community, have closed door mediations between people who are having the conflict outside of the community. Make sure you have healing and reconciliation. You have to integrate the borders between the communities, and you have to have that grief counseling available. The peace councils have to be democratic, and there has to be a method of communication between them and the formal system. And you have to make space for other partners to work. So this is often what has to happen. We use sports, we use transformational workshops, we use income generation, and we make sure that there's follow-through to do that. Sharing this data with the police, as Parris said, is very important, and here we are at different police levels sharing the information in our crime observatory meetings, but we're probably going to call them public safety labs that we need to ensure occur regularly across the island. This is a kind of impact when we've done these things, and we do have the data sustained out to 2014. And what is very encouraging is that the falls that we've seen here are maintained even up to today in these communities. And what we're currently trying to do is look at some of the economic analysis, and we'll hear much more about that. But we're starting to look at trying to show how much, from what we know, it costs us at the hospitals, and how much it costs us for a basic value for a life, as against the cost of the investment. And what is your return? What's your dollar return for this kind of investment? This is it done at a small community level. It was driven by one of the senior medical officers at the hospital in this community. That basic school built by a development agency was never being used, but the solo was a guy that was shot and had gone. Mixed housing methods, ability in the community, but they set up a community peace council. And those are the guys in the T-shirt. One is a pastor, one is just a guy off the road. And the old people can enjoy life, play dominoes, have a party. They had a party for us. And actually we were visited by Leif from Sweden and that. What's important is what spun out of this is the VPA tries to strengthen NGOs in communities already. And you notice this one is called Holy Networks, but as well as him running a little business where he faxes, laminates, he facilitates learning. So it's learning networks, how you learn online to learn. But you learn your life skills up in the hills where there's green grass and blue-green therapy is applied, and counseling therapy, and learning skills from Adobe and video counseling, and transforming the lives of some of these guys in these hotspot areas. And trying to link them to opportunities that are economic and give them the ability to earn a decent living.
So finally, I just wanted to note that in this conference, we're all data people here, but it's something that we shouldn't forget, at least in Jamaica, why we're doing this. And it's really the investment in the youth, and it's something that has been very rewarding for us today. Thank you very much.